Void Dwellers. We live in a time when being triggered is the order of the day. And that is because we actually live in a time when being a victim is celebrated. And this, like many other things, can be traced to a trend pushed at us for decades by Hollywood. And no, this is not a conspiracy theory, mind you. I personally don't believe in conspiracies. But there are things that just naturally fall into place by our human weaknesses that may give the appearance of a conspiracy, and this is one of those things. See, the Hollywood trend of making the victim into the star is not new, nor did it come from a bad place. From the early years of cinema, creators understood there is a commercial potential in depicting characters that their audience can either identify with or condescend over. Chaplin was perhaps the great father of that understanding. The Little Tramp worked so well with audiences because he worked on both of those levels. See, until the 19th century, a lot of the great works of art dealt with upper-class people or even gods and mythic creatures. The process of stepping away from these characters in favor of more earthly and everyday characters starts in the 18th century under the influence of the Enlightenment movement, but it really kicks in the 19th century with great novels by such authors as Dickens and Jules Verne and Louisa May Alcott and Mary Shelley, or great plays by Ibsen or Chekhov. Suddenly it's not the kings and nobility who are the stars. It's not old German gods and fantastic creatures. It's normal working people. It's orphans, it's teachers, it's doctors and it's journalists. It's soldiers or people who lost their fortune. And this trend could be seen in all forms of art, from the Impressionists, who turned their attention from the old subject material of religion and nobility to the quiet country life and scenery of regular folk, to poetry, who used to be used to elevate supposedly high concepts of religion and nobility, and now was used to discuss personal griefs and existential wanderings, like in the incredible writings of Walt Whitman. Then the 20th century gave us cinema, and the trend continued there. Enters Chaplin. The Little Tramp is both every one of us and a promise that things could always get worse. In his essence, he is naive and simple. His motivation is always very down to earth. The next meal, the next job, love. He seems like this tiny little creature, a child almost, just traveling aimlessly around the world, trying to find his place and constantly being assaulted by the difficulties that life throws at him. More often than not, those difficulties appear in the form of the upper classes, both the rich and the political class. Honestly, I could just have an entire video dedicated to the genius of Chaplin, and perhaps I would in the future, but that's not the point of this particular video. In any case, Hollywood understood from day one that their audience is the masses, not the snotty few at the palaces and estates, but the working people. So that is who they made their movies for. And in many of them, the hero would be a working class person, someone with no particular advantage or privilege, and they would have to fence off against those who do have advantage and privilege. And of course, the hero would triumph in the end. This template has remained true throughout the decades, regardless of genres. Whether it's a private eye getting to the bottom of things, or a farm boy on a faraway galaxy who is dragged into war, or a high school girl fighting against a serial killer, the stories always had an unlikely hero in one of us. The fantasy they sold us was, of course, that this could just as easily be us. They said, you see, they are just normal people, just like you. And they do extraordinary things, and so can you. And most of us, and this is the kicker, knew that they were bullshitting us. I remember myself watching Back to the Future as a kid and seeing that scene where Marty is on the skateboard with the bullies after him and Lorraine says, "Isn't he a dream?" And I knew I was no Marty McFly. I was more of a George McFly. But we didn't go to these movies because we thought the fantasy was real. We went because for 90 minutes, we were all of us Marty McFlys. And that was fine. It was enough. And then something else, very positive, started happening in Hollywood. People started realizing that you can actually bring forward voices that weren't heard usually. You can empower the weak. You can use that to change public opinion for the better. Now, unlike what people think, this wasn't just a leftist thing to do. True, there are movies that did help bring forward themes that are considered traditionally leftist, like the problem of gay rights and persecution with movies such as Philadelphia. But then you also had that first Rambo movie with Stallone's terrific speech in the end. Now, liberals like to make fun of that speech because the manifesto says, "Ew, soldier." But I remember the impact it had on me as a kid. As someone who was mostly on the left for most of my life, I realized that the image of the American Vietnam soldier as this brutal, unfeeling killing machine was nonsense. For the first time, I heard their voices, their struggle. And I heard it again in such movies as Forrest Gump or Born in the 4th of July. For me, it didn't matter if the movie was written from a liberal or a conservative point of view. The point was hearing the voices I didn't usually get to hear. And Hollywood was great at that. And then, slowly but surely, in one of those things where you don't really realize things have changed until you suddenly look back and you go, how did I get here? Instead of letting unheard voices be heard, Hollywood started making the victim into the star. Not in a good inclusive sense, but in a you're only a star if you're first a victim sense. See, the audience always roots for the underdog. It's not from an altruistic place, by the way. It's quite the contrary. The underdog story makes people think, well, if he can do it, of course I can. I'm so much better. So they love hearing those kind of stories. And so, driven by the forces of the free market, Hollywood looked to push even more victim heroes. And when they ran out of real ones, they just kept going with pretend ones. They glorified victimhood itself. And we got to a point where if your hero is not a victim, if there's no great tragedy or struggle, then you don't have a main character. The main character has to have a struggle now, preferably a racial one, or one that has to do with their identity, as long as it's not being Jewish, because nobody cares about that identity. But any tragic struggle would do. Look at the original Ghostbusters. Those characters, who have been proven to work very well throughout the decades, with several generations, would have never been written now. Why? Because there's no tragedy there. They're just a bunch of geeks with an idea. Men, white, no tragic backstory. What's the point then? Today they would have been seen as too privileged to have a movie centered around them. As you go from the 90s to our times, more and more of the heroes are persecuted, bullied, marginalized, and it sometimes goes to very silly and strange places. For example, the admiration the character of the Joker receives, specifically in Heath Ledger and Joaquin Phoenix's versions. Regardless of the Joker's objectively horrifying crimes, he is depicted as a sympathetic villain, which is not a bad thing in itself. The story is far more engaging when you enjoy the villain as much as you enjoy the hero. But the Joker is placed on this mantle like no other villain. And it usually comes with two connected attitudes. One, he is perceived as freer than the rest of us. He lives outside of society. He says the truth. That's the populist appeal of the character, at least in that incarnation. And two, he is not to blame for how he is. It's because of his troubled past. And that is the point that too many people adopt and want to emulate themselves. Being a victim gets you in the picture. That's the first and foremost thing. If you don't have a tragic tale, you're not worth a movie. That is the message, and oh boy, did the kids hear it loud and clear. And as a bonus, your tragic tale gives you a get out of jail free card for any wrongdoing on your part, because people should show sympathy to someone with your background. Now, of course, in real life, most people are not homicidal psychopaths like the Joker is, so it translates into just bullying and being rude and cruel to people, both in real life and online. And this has mutated now into, if I am the offended side, I cannot possibly be wrong. And that is how we got to a time when being triggered is the call of the day. If you are upset by what someone told you, then you cannot possibly be blamed for anything you say or do, or for not really addressing what was said. You feel attacked. Every time I hear someone says, I feel attacked, I don't think, oh, you poor thing. I think, then you obviously have never been attacked in your life, and you had a sheltered and very privileged life, and you should get your head out of your own ass. People who are actually being attacked are not in a position to say that they feel attacked. And in their attempt to grab the attention of the crowd for their own selfish reasons, they've gone back to marginalizing those who already have no voice. We live in a world where, once again, only the strong, the popular, the privileged have a voice. Now they are disguised as untouchable victims. They are hitchhikers, people who are not really what they say they are, but pretend to be, sometimes with very little effort, and nobody is allowed to even call them out because the moment they have a tragic struggle on their side, real or otherwise, they are infallible. Ever read of a phenomenon that is supposed to be a tiny proportion of the population, but suddenly has risen by hundreds of percent in kids and young adults? Yeah, that's why. But let me speak of one that I take kind of personally. And it's not an easy one for me to talk about. The mental health issue. I used to see sometimes those 20-year-old kids on Reddit or Facebook posting pictures of themselves smiling and writing, "After 2 weeks in bed, I just got over my depression." Boom! 2 million upvotes and countless "Oh, you're so brave" comments. Now let me tell you right now, as someone who was diagnosed with depression at 16, there isn't one person out there who has depression, real depression, and saw those posts and didn't think to themselves, "Oh, go fuck yourself." Because that is not fucking depression. Depression is not something that you just get over after 2 weeks in bed and you post a picture of yourself on social media about it. Depression is a long life debilitating condition, fatal for some of us. It is not something we publish, it is something we keep private. It is not used to gain attention. It is something that stops you from wanting any kind of attention and then feeling horribly lonely because you drove everyone away. It's a private and difficult thing to live with. And I removed that part from my script, by the way, repeatedly. And I would probably re-edit this video repeatedly. And I'm not sure if you guys would get to see this part of the video. Because if you truly have depression, then your mode of operation, your default, is to always deny that you have it. You're fine. The last thing you need is for them to know that you cannot function like an adult. You're fine. Everything's fine. Everything is normal. And that's the point. From my perspective, those hitchhikers are privileged people, regardless of their ethnicity, by the way, or sexual orientation, or anything else. And they are using their much stronger voices to hitchhike on an issue they do not really have in order to gain some self-momentum, and they are stepping over the heads of those who actually suffer from the condition. And that is the true meaning of privileged. See, the word privilege has become one of those trigger words people now use. Some people use it to shut people up, to rob people of their voices. Some use it to be triggered and complain that they were robbed of their voices. If you look through my videos, you'll see I have used the term white privilege myself, and a lot of commenters didn't like that. The thing is, I used it in context when I wanted to point out that the person talking and being very judgmental and racist is doing so from a point of view that doesn't include experiences that the people they were judging have and therefore could not fully understand their perspective. But that does not mean that all white people are privileged or that only white people are privileged. Privilege is a point of view as well. It is context sensitive. It is relative. From my perspective, as someone who was born in Israel to a poor and dysfunctional family, anyone born in the UK is privileged, including black people, Muslims, gay. It doesn't matter that you are a minority here. I view your starting point as far better than my own, and I had to go through shit that you were shielded from. So you are privileged to me. On the other hand, in Israel, there's a population of immigrants who came from Africa, specifically from Sudan and Eritrea. These people risk their lives going through scorching deserts, many times being abused by human traffickers, only to get to the place where I was born. So to them, I am privileged. The point of the word is not bad and pretty important. It's about context and perspective. But it was taken to stupid places, like all things these days. It should mean I have experiences I don't think you had to go through. And that is definitely something you need to take into account when talking to someone. But it does not mean I think you are not entitled to a voice or an opinion. I do think people would do well to not have an opinion on things they are not entirely familiar with, that they don't completely understand. And I think it would be good for people to realize when they are not in a position to understand. But I don't think we should use differences between us to silence each other. I think we need to communicate more, not less. Maybe we can just approach this with reason. If someone tells you you are privileged, ask them how. If all they have is, "You're white," maybe try to explain that being white doesn't automatically make you privileged. And perhaps they can be more specific and explain how are you privileged in relations to what is being discussed. And if they insist that you being white is enough, maybe they're not worth your time. But if they say, well, here are some bad experiences that I had that I don't think you had, maybe give them a listen. Maybe take their experiences into account. And maybe we can all remember, there is no main character in this movie. We are all extras. We all make shit pay and no one will remember our names when the credits roll. So be decent to each other.